in the year 800. That's something that nobody could do. I mean, by Roman law, only another emperor could only an emperor could create another emperor. So here you see how the papacy is already actually on the rise from this ideological point of view, in order to create certain autonomous prerogatives for the Church of Rome and the Vicary of Christ. So this is perhaps, the Longobard action drastically accelerated this, because if there had been no threat, we can imagine that all these contacts with the Franks would have fundamentally been of a different nature. Generally speaking, you can argue that the situation was the one that it was. So, of course, it was a broader destiny, if you want. I don't like this term given to history. There's nothing teleological, but it's obvious that a Frankish power, a reunified Frankish power like the one of the Carolingians, was transforming itself, was kind of naturally projected towards the Mediterranean. Rome was there. Naturally, things got extremely complicated, because also at the time of Charlemagne, theoretically, Rome could side from the side of the Longobards. This is something that is often overlooked, but it was also a matter of intern. There was a pro-Longobard faction also in Rome that fought actively against the pro-Frankish one. So if that had won, and the Longobards were playing heavily into that, maybe even Charlemagne would have not been called, or at least there would have been very different modalities of development of his own power. Who knows? So history really does change so much. Can really change so much. Now I know that the video is getting a bit too long, but there are so many diplomatic clashes in many ways that were occurring now, also with the Byzantines, many things, but there are maybe some details that are useful, but whatever. So just think of many actors involved. Just remember also the clergy of Ravenna. It was very, again, pretty much anti-Roman in many ways, anti-Pope, let's say better. There were so many factors, and even the same conquest of Italy, it doesn't matter how easy it had been to crush the Longobard army, might have gone wrong if reattempted. So I don't think we have many sources on the surprise of the Franks for having achieved that result so easily, but I think that surely now was creating some debate, and the within even the same Frankish society, that now there were so many Longobards that were also saying, what the hell? We have been invaded so easily, what now? I mean, what about our future? What about in fact, in later times, many Longobards actually fled to Francia because they realized that things were getting seriously wrong, and they wanted to save themselves from further, from the conquest that in fact would occur. Relatively to the territorial conditions of the peace treaty, as we've seen, Aistulf completely ignored them. So there is just I think the the information that Narni had probably been given back, or at least there are certain letters that tell us that this was done. These were in the embassies to Pippin, but there was fundamentally no consequence to this. The Franks had not stayed there to wait the Longobards to give those territories back. Fundamentally, we think that the Franks were even bothered by this. I mean, they didn't want to be there in the first place at the beginning. When the bad season started once again, Aistulf kind of put things together with from a military point of view, and he collected fundamentally all the contingents of the kingdom in August, so even before the bad season, literally everywhere in Italy. The Longobard army at this point was directed towards Rome. So in terms of organization, the Rome is pretty central. So the idea was to make all these contingents converge on Rome from the various areas. I mean, it was useless for, I don't know, for the Duke of Benevent to send his army, from southern Italy to northern Italy to go back to central Italy. I mean, it doesn't make many sense. So since Rome was also a pretty large city, was also this problem of surrounding it or putting it under blockade. So Aistulf organized, just like the other predecessors that had moved against Rome, this kind of pincer maneuver, saving consistent strategical assets by simply decentralizing the process, and attacked Rome. Now Rome was strong, but at the same time was without much of a defense. The Roman city, it had its military families. They had the scole, even corporations of foreigners that lived in Rome because of all the pilgrims came all over Europe that had also their military contingents, etc. But it wasn't a power on its own. The Longobards occupied almost the whole peninsula, so they had an enormous amount of resources compared to Rome. It was kind of a giant against a midget. So Aistulf at this point was counting on the fact that especially the Alpine passes would have been blocked at least for up to the late spring of 756. I mean, not maybe late spring, but that had a consistent time before the Franks could pass the Alps with that weather and so on. The year of 756, and therefore Aistulf hoped to capture Rome, and so obtaining this enormous victory that at that point he could do it, because we have seen that the Franks now, there wasn't much of an option now. The conquering Rome now would have not worsened the situation fundamentally. On the contrary, could have raised the morale of the Longobards, and therefore the idea was to seize Rome during the bad season and to eventually go face once again the Franks at the Alpine passes at locks. Also, northeastern Italy was perfectly fine. There was no other major power there that could create any problem. The same Aistulf, as we've seen, came from Austria, so he knew, the Friulans were perfectly, supportive of this enterprise, so everything was fine. At this point also Aistulf had secured the relations with Byzantine Venezia, so this region of the lagoons, also from which Venice would stem fundamentally, because that was Byzantine territory. It had not been captured because in fact the lagoons are kind of inaccessible. Also the Carolingians would get bogged down trying to secure them. Even Charlemagne's son would die of malaria in there, so nobody had reasons to, and that's how Venice survived over the centuries as an independent thing on its own. And also he received a sensible support from the anti-Roman party of Ravenna. So everything was relatively fine. And on January the 1st, 756, Rome was under siege by the Longobard army. So it seems that the Longobard army was well furnished of siege weaponry, of enough troops basically to surround to block the whole city ring. So this is pretty important, because it shows that the Longobards had lots of resources to spend. They could besiege a city like Rome. It was something relatively difficult for a Romano-Germanic kingdom to besiege a city like that in terms of resources. It tells you that this system did work. We have a letter that was written by the desperate Stephen II to Pippin, where when the siege was lasting from 45 days. And from this letter, that is obviously, loaded with, he's asking, come to save us, because we're in trouble, serious trouble now. The Longobards are described as criminals, fundamentally. He talks about the countryside that was put under, was devastated, on fire and pillaged, and the fact that churches and monasteries were being, were not being spared, that the peasants were being caught as prisoners or slaughtered, even if they were women. No mercy was seemingly showed for the monks, and female, nuns, etc., were, and other women were raped and slaughtered. And even there was this. This all belongs. I mean, you understand the accent, the emphasis that is put on the thing of the church, like the idea that the Longobards ate fundamentally the host and wine after having stuffed themselves with meat, so committing this kind of sacrilege. So everything was naturally oriented to show the deprivation of Longobards. Now we don't. I mean, I'm not saying that Longobards were saints at this point, of course not. But I mean, these were, everybody at the time did the same exact thing. I always recall that Carolingian capitulary into Italy at the time of Ludwig II, that says the same exact thing in much more realistic terms, because it's a Frankish capitulary aimed to discipline the Frankish army in Italy, the Carolingian army of Italy, that says, when Lent approaches, do not rape and do not burn churches. And these were soldiers that were going to fight against the Saracens in southern Italy. So why would they have to rape and destroy churches, therefore in Christian territory? Well, seemingly this was the normality, even in friendly territory. So it's perfectly plausible that the Longobards did what they did, also because they hated maybe what the Pope had done recently. But I mean, it's obviously part propaganda, partly violence was carried out anyway. So it's kind of the same. We know that probably certain graveyards, suburban graveyards, or certain relics were profaned because these sepulchres were very, very rich. So some Longobard warrior surely took the chance to seize such stuff, because we're very. Also, you can imagine all the logistical problems, all the stables to which certain churches or tombs were turned, so all this stuff. However, we don't know how much, more or less expectedly, Rome resisted. Rome resisted And this this was pretty amazing, because morally and materially it proved that even the papacy at this point was a kind of a solid power, could resist such a siege, such a great displayment of forces. So it's not to be given for granted. And especially as we've seen, the Longobards were pretty much concerned about time, because once the ice had melted, Pippin now would have invaded Italy once again. Naturally, the Franks were preparing to go save Rome from this, so the seasonal changing was putting a lot of pressure on the Longobards, and they fundamentally obliged Aistulf to lift the siege from Rome. The siege had lasted 3 months. And we know that at the beginning of April 756, Aistulf was already in Pavia, where he also emanated a diploma in favor of the Farfa Abbey, once again. We know that the Longobard army marches up to the Lochs of St. Michael. At this point, however, we don't know whether Aistulf was together with the Longobard army or not, just like the year before. All we know is that the Longobards do exactly the same thing. They attack the Frankish vanguards, and they were once again excuse me, no, they didn't behave like that at all. Sorry, I'm wrong. They didn't attack the vanguards of the enemy army. I don't know, maybe at that time they would have made it. But basically the Frankish army attacks en masse the Lochs, and the Longobards at this point defend. So from the Longobard mentality, this is also proof of inferiority, because essentially the true Germanic warrior has to attack frontally, just like they had done the years before, ending up the way we have seen. And the great mass of the Frankish army crushes the Longobards, and their army is fundamentally routed once again. And Pippin, and together with the Frankish army, once again goes rapidly under the walls of Pavia. So this happened exactly 1 year after the year before, the first expedition. And this I know it sounded stupid. This happened exactly 1 year after the year before. Well, thank you. I mean, the former expedition, so the same times fundamentally. And it's impressive, because the thing really repeated itself in the same way. And at the end of June 756, there was a second peace treaty that was actually signed by by a request of Aistulf himself, through the priests and the great noblemen that were in the ranks of the Frankish army. So formally speaking, this peace was fundamentally a confirmation of the previous pact of the year before. The various parts of the pact were formally, just like the year before, I didn't say that, but it was between the Romans, the Franks, and the Longobards. Notice the order: Romans, Franks, and Longobards as well. But it was substantially different in the contents, or better, in the on the heaviness, the weight of the conditions fundamentally, because these conditions were much harsher, and they were legitimated by the fact that the Longobard king fundamentally had not respected the oath that he had made the previous year, and also by the same attack on Rome, that now had revealed directly what this thing had been about, what the Longobards had wanted to do. up to that point. Now, the Longobards were issued to give back all the cities that had been listed in the previous piece, with the addition of Comacchio. Comacchio was essentially the Venice ante litteram. Essentially, was this other uh, mm, city city. I mean, it was a settlement that had um, developed in the lagoons of the Adriatic Sea, close to Venice, just like Venice, on peelings, and that had developed very fast, also especially in the economical circuit of northern Italy, for the Byzantine and Longobard market alike, actually, as an essential trade point, because it was the center of salt export, and salt at the time was extremely important, extremely costly, because it was one of the only materials that was used basically to preserve food, chiefly meat. So it was extremely costly and was an extremely precious resource to control. So this, it was very important for the Longobard economy, because Comacchio is located at the mouth of the Po River. So Pavia is on the Po, and the Po crosses the whole valley, the whole Po Valley, in fact, and therefore all the cities benefit from this trade. So the Comacchio also traded extensively with the Byzantine East, so it was an incredibly important center. The Longobards lost it with this peace. The war repair costs are much higher for the Longobards than in the previous years, and in addition to them, the Longobards are symbolically meant to give to the Franks, well, 1/3 of the royal treasury of Pavia. So a huge toll. For what it concerned the relations between the Longobards and the Franks, Pippin once again spared the Longobards from direct conquest. Fundamentally, the Longobards live on as a kingdom until Charlemagne's conquest, into which actually also the Longobard kingdom survives, but now under the Carolingians that settled their own army, disband everything. At this point, the Longobard kingdom instead remains. Pippin makes of the Longobards tributaries. So it established this tribute that has to be yearly, paid through certain, opposite personnel of 5,000 soldi. Was pretty high. And this tribute was fundamentally written on the base of the ancient demand that the Merovingians had done to the Longobards into the 6th century. Because into the 6th century, the Longobards had risked to be wiped out by the Franks and the Byzantines combined, and in order to save their skins, they began to pay this tribute to the Merovingians. Now, this at a certain point was basically stopped being paid, I think, in the 7th century or at some point. There were other hostages that were... there was a new oath, first of all, that Aistulf had to swear, and other hostages that had to be sent to to Francia. And Aistulf was even obliged to insult himself indirectly, practically stating, directly actually, stating by contract that he would have not been anymore rebellis et contumax to Pippin and to the great of the Frankish kingdom, and to remain instead promising to remain instead a fidelis, so a faithful, and not to rebel anymore, to persist in this intent. Just like the year before, by July, Pippin was already in France, and he assisted, in fact, to the solemn translation of the body of Saint-Germain in the seat of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. And in this basilica, it was consecrated to the saint, famously, was a 6th century saint, was bishop of that seat, very important for French, the Frankish monarchy. And interestingly enough, also in this year, however, Pippin never actually enforced those conditions that would have taken care of the actual delivery of, let's say, restitution better, of the papal territories to Rome. So there was some formal act of donation at this point, but and there was some actual, Aistulf at this point obeyed, so he took care of the thing. So he basically gave back, and this is particularly important, these territories to a emissary of the Papal of the Pope, fundamentally, and he gave these territories back, even though the Pope could not really control them from Rome. This is interesting because there was this situation in which there was ever more complicated, because now these territories were fundamentally lost. They were ruled by certain figures that now I wouldn't even know how to describe, and how this, there were surely these papal officials with guards and all, but the control was pretty mild, as you can imagine. This was not a time in which the Pope could extend his formal direct control over these lands. It wouldn't happen for centuries and centuries. So this was a kind of it increased the general agitation of the situation, the weakness of the system. The Longobards lost money. These territories remained without a head, fundamentally, an effective head at least. And this was the way in which Aistulf obeyed, and in which he lost a great part of its conquests. It lost even the city of Narni, that he had not conquered, but Liutprand did. So this was also there was a kind of a punishment of the Longobard kingdom as a whole in this process, and the Longobard kingdom came out of this sensibly weakened. The Silentiarius John, so the representative of the emperor, had re-entered in Ravenna, so giving this glorious speech. I mean, not glorious, let's say better, proud speech, for saying, we came back here, but also in here the Byzantines never quite reacquired those lands. It was just a formality, where everything was extremely difficult to control from that distance. So, very big mess, really, and for the poor Aistulf, and this was, however, not enough for him. This is the extraordinary thing about this. Aistulf was not a quitter. He thought that his duty was to fight against. He felt probably to be a true Longobard, to have certain duties towards his people as his king. You can argue that Aistulf represented, in fact, the best Longobard spirit in its warlike, in ancient warlike nature. Still at this time, at late, the second half of the 8th century, where, as we've seen, Longobard culture had fundamentally relatively diluted from the times of the origin. And there was naturally at this point there was a massive fall naturally in the contractual power of the Longobard kingdom, also in the international seat. The Franks and Byzantines began to talk with each other incessantly. There was all the problem now what would happen, because the Byzantines were now the, the situation was unfavorable for them. Had the Franks invaded Italy once again to stay this time. There were several other arrangements now for the disposition of the papal goods, the papal properties, the territory, I mean, that had been gone back. And in here, probably the most important thing was the fact that Ravenna was not come back under the under an exarch. There was no exarch. It was re-elected. It was just, the representatives of the Bishop of Rome that had taken formally the control, together with the Roman military aristocracy. But as we've seen, the situation was also difficult for the Pope to control this and this was very serious for the Byzantines at one point, because there wasn't much for now the fact that the Longobards had invaded and de facto dissolved the Exarchate. But the real problem now was the impasse with the Franks, because excuse me. Now the Franks were de facto disposing of the Byzantine Franks that we have seen had been relatively respectful toward the Byzantines, but in perspective, if you think about it now, it was the Frankish king that basically disposed of the Byzantine territories of the Exarchate, now to be given to this or that. And this is something that the Byzantines could not tolerate, because as you imagine, they now what was this barbarian king who could dispose of the lands of the empire? But nevertheless, also from a strictly practical point of view, the problem now was that, first of all, the Byzantines couldn't take those lands back, that the Pope had seized those territories as well, that de facto imperial authority in central Italy, northern Italy, had almost completely vanished. The Longobard kingdom was standing still there, but it was a fragile thing. It could crumble from a moment to another, opening the Franks, as we've seen, the gates of the Mediterranean, and therefore making them border directly with the Byzantines, in which they were surely not happy. So the whole thing at this point was really, from Aistulf's perspective, terrible, but somehow it was leaving, because of these new enmities that had been formed, some kind of room still to, especially for what it concerned dealing with the Frankish problem that could be, as before. Now we've seen the same objective of the Byzantines, so Aistulf naturally could rightfully say, "Who is Pippin to intervene, in fact, into Italy, in general?" And this is the greater perspective. I mean, it's. I would like to leave you also with this idea that without the papal demands, the papal request, in fact, the Franks would have not intervened by themselves into Italy. I mean, surely this might have happened sooner or later, but much later than sooner. I mean, compared, historically speaking, to what happened. We've seen even the resistance that the Franks were doing. Now, Pippin was forced, was pushed, was brought to enter into Italy. Not forced, really, but, it was enticed. And the real problem is a matter of legitimacy. Who was Pippin as king of the Franks to enter into the Longobard kingdom, into Byzantine territory? This was the real problem at an international level, and I don't know. I never considered this perspective also in the development of the institutional development of the empire. I mean, we all know that Franks had this very strong imperialistic mindset since the very beginning, or better, since the sixth, since Clovis fundamentally, that passed from the Merovingians directly into the Carolingians. However, even this idea of overlordship is particularly important because it might have also surpassed this legalistic impasse of this local interference. Like even the crowning of Charlemagne eventually brought to this concept that the authority, the imperial authority, belonged to who had the imperium proper. So that at this point you don't have to look at the Franks as just one kingdom among the others, but as fundamentally emperors, at least the Carolingians, as emperors of the West even. So this naturally had yet to be formulated. Even in 800 it wasn't so clearly defined at all. This is something that mostly developed into the Ottonian era as a fully developed imperial ideology, but it was still important because they had to mask, and believe me, probably at the time was extremely important, even from from an emotional and political point of view at the same time, that the Franks had invaded someone else's land without permission. Because one thing is to, the Franks had this amount of territories that had been subdued by in the 6th century fundamentally. Then there had been other kingdoms. Take the Burgundians, take the Alemannian part, were not really a kingdom, but they were something on their own. What about now that and they had also expanded into certain lands but there were still tribesmen like the Thuringians or the Saxons, were other peoples that were not really a unitary entity. But a Longobard Italy was kind of a big thing at the time. People usually don't give a damn about Longobards Italy, but it was kind of a big chunk of Europe at the time, and the invasion of Italy opened to a series of legitimacy problems in terms of the reconstruction of the empire that could, in this sense, into which the problems of having invaded someone else's land without any valid reason. And that's why partly also the empire probably was created, let's say, for legitimizing, for fundamentally washing away this bad memory, this kind of infamous memory of the fact that one people had been wiped out for no reason. This is something particularly evident because it stemmed from papal interference. Even with Charlemagne, or Charlemagne, if you prefer, was married to a Longobard princess, notoriously, because after this episode, now the Franks have once again, after Pippin's death, there is the usual problem of the Franks. The kingdom gets split up once again between Charles and Carloman, and at this point, Charlemagne needs external support, and the Franks marry and the king Longobard King Desiderius, that follows Ratchis after he rose to the throne after Aistulf's death, let one of his daughters marry Charlemagne. When the Pope calls Charlemagne into Italy for this time, Charlemagne is obliged fundamentally to repudiate the Longobard princess, and this was a shame. I mean, today we say just, okay, he repudiated her, we say it sounds like a gossip, but for the international law of the time, repudiating a woman of royal blood, by the way, okay, Desiderius came to be king in a kind of, he wasn't even a ducal ancestry, but it was illegal. It meant to contradict the pacts. I mean, in the Germanic relations, the fact that you had married, that you had sworn an oath, as we've seen now also with Aistulf, was something extremely important. Because you have given your word. So if you have to be a true man, you had to maintain your word, which would be cool even if we did it today, because I don't today we're disgusting, morally speaking, but aside from okay, well, I know I don't want to make a relativism, but just for saying that, even at the time, it's not that people were better necessarily, but they at least they used these forms to stress the fact that it was even a public shame deriving from contravening these pacts. This is very important, and that's also why, however, now what had justified the very harsh treatment of Aistulf in this, after he had gone under contrarily to the pacts, because at that point, by the second invasion, Pippin had the legal justification of Aistulf having, broken the agreement under oath, but the point is, who had called Pippin the first time into Italy? So it's very controversial, morally speaking, because international law did exist at the time as well in practice, even if it was not really codified. So there are so many now Aistulf also basically tries to maintain close relations with with Ravenna, because there was this anti-papal party that now was less happy than ever, because the Pope had finally and incredibly reached control, at least nominally, of Ravenna itself. So all details that unfortunately bring us to an end, because Aistulf in this context in December 756 dies in a very unexpected, in an accident, in a hunting accident. He basically was hunting on horseback, and he was catapulted out. He fell out of his horse. He crashed against a tree, fundamentally, and he died 3 days later for the wounds. Hunting accident were very, very frequent cause of death among kings at the time, and this is literally how Aistulf died, and it's kind of sad. I don't know. It's just my feeling, and but what it's amazing is that, in fact, the tradition was, at least given to certain sources, that he had wanted to basically take arms once again for the third time. So pretty resilient king. So, as a conclusion on the figure of Aistulf, basically everything we know about him, aside from the Longobard tradition that stops fundamentally, that Paul the Deacon stopped to write the Longobard history with Liutprand, because eventually what happened later wasn't fitting. That Paul the Deacon is the first and most important source of for Longobard history. He probably wrote this history for the Carolingians back in the day. Paul the Deacon was of Friuland, was also brother of the Friuland Duke that rebelled to the Carolingians, but eventually he went into this milieu. And his story stops to the reign of Liutprand, because it had been the most glorious, edifying kingdom of reign of the Longobards. And there is this episode of Aistulf and Ratkis when they were young. But further history about the reigns of Ratkis and Aistulf are told us mostly from other sources, chiefly Papal, but also Franks. And in these sources you find the terrible insults that are in the gloomy picture that represents Aistulf. So this nefandus rex that basically is punished by God, this divine vengeance, because he was so evil and bad and rebellious, and he had gone against the pacts. The Stephen II's biographer makes this list of gratuitous insults to tyrant, pertervious, atrocious, most evil, pestilential, malign, unjust, son of iniquity, perfidus, I don't know if it is in English, a liar, perjurer, faithless, of course, and of diabolically ingenious. So all the worst, and in fact, he's described to have died divino ictu, so by actually a divine stroke in his accident. So there is this eternal condemnation of this. Obviously, why does this is propaganda. That's the least they could say. Papal propaganda was extremely subtle and effective, and but it was subtle as this, just depicting this in Felix Aistulf as kind of a symbol of terrible king, Longobard king. Also the same Stephen II wrote about Aistulf, saying perhaps something more moderated, but and very meaningful in many ways. He basically describes him as the devastator, the devastator, I know you say it in English, of the Roman city, and who had basically put his own fate into trouble. It's interesting that a pope says, that not that he was really faithless, but he had brought. There is a kind of psychological understanding. He says he put in peril his own faith. This is fascinating, given that with the Longobards, even this idea that Aistulf was a Catholic, of course, but as a freeland was maybe more traditionalist, and therefore maybe, I don't know, he believed the old gods or stuff like that. It's a bit romantic, a bit suggesting, but suggestive, sorry, but probably it's not true. I want to believe that Aistulf was a good Christian. The real point, it would have been interesting to know what is that the political horizons of a Longobard king in the 8th century. How did Aistulf look at the future of the Longobards? What did they think about the Franks, about the Byzantines? Not much about the Papacy, because actually we can't understand it. But it's interesting that the same Pope recognizes him, in fact, as a Christian. And it couldn't be differently otherwise. The Longobards were fully Christianized. They were officially Catholic. They did everything in the name of God. So they couldn't be called pagans, like back in, when there were Arians. And in the 6th century, most of them were still not even Christian, probably by belief. Or maybe, by right, because that's also a problem of interpretation. But however, this this comprehension from the side of Stephen doesn't save Aistulf in his mind, because he calls him Tyrannus ille sequax diaboli Aistulfus devorator sanguinum Christianorum ecclesiarum Dei destructor divino icto percussus est et in inferni voraginem demersus. So a terrible phrase that basically sends Aistulf to hell, because it says that tyrant, the devil's follower, Aistulf, eater of Christian blood and devourer of Christian blood, destructor of God's of the churches of God, fundamentally, and in fact hit by divine stroke is, and it's sent into the chasm of hell. So it's terrible, and the it's terrible because naturally, obviously, it's been expressed by a pope, and you can't be surprised if even by such contextual judgments, such characters have passed to history as kind of monsters. I mean, this is the stigma that even still the Longobards have for many reasons, but even such words, such clashes have deeply influenced the perception that we have of the Longobards. It's perfectly normal. I think at a pop cultural level, I know many people don't even know that the Longobards exist, but among the people who know about them, there are so many that still have these negative prejudices. And now, obviously, I don't have time to explain the whole thing, because I do it. I will do it also in other videos. Now it's not the case. The video is enormously long. This is the longest video I made in absolute terms. But the important thing here is to remember that such words weigh. I mean, in historiography, this is how even the general ecclesiastical view of history has been. This king was kind of a negative figure, and that's how eventually it passes to history. What else can we say about this? So there is some considerations of the general reputation of the Longobards that I will skip now, but just bear in mind that like 80% literally of the negative judgment of the Longobards at an emotional level stems from papal propaganda of those times. I mean, if you take that off, you have no, these tones get away. You get the picture from a neutral point of view. And it's obvious. You have to understand the papacy as well. They were fighting with their own weapons, their ideological weapons. The real problem is for us today to be so naive not to understand this, not to be able to read it. I mean, there are so many people, especially reading medieval history, who are not able to distinguish propaganda from reality, even when propaganda is actually an historical datum and object of studying, because we do study medieval propaganda today in university. It's very interesting, it's very deep, it's very complex. It shows intelligence, a culture, education, theoretical, political theory, etc. So it's extremely important. Just be aware about this in 2019, not to read history thinking, oh, this is written in history, this is true. No, you have to understand what it is. You have to contextualize it, and it's pretty normal. Now, I don't want to accuse, of course, historiography today is kind of epurated, fortunately, by such attitudes, but popular awareness is not really so. So, what else? And there were naturally many other writers, even in the immediate following centuries, that addressed this figure, fundamentally copying the various. But the picture, the Papal sources. But the picture I would like to leave you with about Aistulf is a much brighter one. First of all these judgments against the church are very one-sided, as you understand. We know that Aistulf, by his legislation and acts and concessions, was probably moved by a warm religious feeling. In his proemies of the laws emanated in Pavia, just in 754, when the Pope was negotiating in France with Pippin against him, quotes the Psalms and the wisdom, and he declared himself obedient as legislator to the precepts of the Holy Scriptures, and that he stated explicitly to wish to be appreciated in everything by by Almighty God, through the help of which he was reigning fundamentally, following the example of his own predecessor, to impose to the Longobard people some laws that fundamentally some laws that through which they had wanted with all their heart to please the great Redeemer of all times. So here the Longobard monarchy was fully inspired to fully Catholic principles, and Aistulf was perfectly faithful to this line. There are other in these laws. For instance, there is the example of the Redeemer that had fundamentally made himself a serf in order to give mankind of freedom, and through the authorities of St. Paul he had motivated the duty to practically free the serfs from a master, from a dead master, and therefore Aistulf had perfected this procedure in the Longobard law. So perfectly inspired even in the freeing of slaves in this Longobard dispositions by the example of Christ. So in these laws, Aistulf had also disposed certain measures to protect the economical interests of bishops, of abbots, of other organizers of churches and hospitals, the interests of the nuns. And even in the laws emanated in the first year of reign in 750, we find reaffirmed the value of law as it had been stated by Liutprand, that was confirmed to the canonical norms. For instance, the ones disposing on the illicit unions, and that were accompanied by these monetary sanctions that were with which the functionaries that had not obeyed to this law, so the public functionaries would have ignored this law, would have been charged with. And these sanctions had been motivated, according to Aistulf, by the unanimous opinion that was shared also by the king, that those who backed these illicit unions were acting against God and against their own soul, and that this was the reason fundamentally of this evil, the major reason of this evil. So there is an intent that goes in the law from the individual to the collective, and that is expressed in a fully Christian fashion. Unfortunately for us, we have a very few amount of relics and information relatively to the documents that were produced by the royal records office, chancellor office, however you want to call it, at the time of Aistulf. This is a problem that we have for several kings. However, the very few ones that we have are enough to show, and this is quite meaningful, the favors that Aistulf granted to bishops, churches, monasteries, hospitals, etc. And we have certain eminent abbeys that benefited from Aistulf's concessions, such as Farfa, Monte Cassino, Saint Vincent at the Volturno River, and naturally these were measures, was not just pious measures. These were very important political centers as well in their, strategical role. We have seen it especially with Farfa, also with the delegation of Monte Cassino Saint Vincent to Pavia that was sent by the Pope. So all, there were many reasons for it. This doesn't prove that Aistulf was forcibly a pious, but he was was not the monster that has been depicted by Papal propaganda, of course. And I don't even know what I'm bothering myself with saying this. It's pretty self-evident. Also, we know something about his wife, Giseltrud. Giseltrud was a sister to a to the Duke of Friuli, that became Duke of Friuli after Aistulf, that eventually retired himself to monastic life. And Aistulf, in the first year of reign, donated, together with his wife, a land, fundamentally, in the Modena Apennine, to her sister. To her brother. His name was Anselm. Where in this land a monastery was founded by the same Anselm, with an annexed hospital that were consecrated to the Savior. Aistulf hence donated to his brother-in-law in some years after a monastery, because now Anselm had become abbot of Nonantola, was also one of the most important monasteries of the Middle Ages. So this gives you the dimension of also how ecclesiastical goods were, taken into consideration. And he restored, Aistulf restored also the Basilica of Ravenna, the ones of the Holy Peter and Paul. He here deposited on the altar a chlamys embroidered in gold that was also, meant to be in continuity with Roman imperial tradition in Ravenna. And he was definitely a pious sovereign, given this evidence. And his legislative work is definitely inspired to Christian ethics and to the norms of ecclesiastical canons, and therefore you can't dismiss these just as nothing. Always bearing in mind that there were greater logics naturally in disposing of these goods, and that there was a great interest also politically speaking, economically speaking, etc. And therefore the relations, the strained relations with Rome have to be understood in the way you can imagine, in a balanced way. Aistulf reigned therefore for several years and a half, more or less, and he leaves a mark. I don't know. I think many people do not know Aistulf in his life, in his works, but it's one of those names that you remind. Yesterday I was googling about him to see how much there is about him already, and surprisingly enough, I found that Google here. Well, I was typing. It already gave me Aistulf, King of the Longobards. So there are people who know about him. This is a name that is somehow remained, historically speaking. For better or for worse, in the perception, the subjective perception can be about him at a in society, but it's a key figure of the time, I would say, because it's Aistulf action that eventually led to this, indirectly, I would say, to the Longobard catastrophe in many ways, and that Longobard catastrophe was not, from a Longobard point of view, of course, was negative, but it's also what triggered eventually the rise of the Carolingian kingdom, the relations with between the Papacy and the Franks. We made several videos on Schwerpunkt about this. There's a lot to say about this, and therefore, without Aistulf, history as we know it would have not been known. He had a very important effect on to determine the history that we study in this crucial moment of the Middle Ages, in which everything was still theoretically to be formed of what we know of the Middle Ages. Thinking about the Holy Roman Empire, the relations between empire and papacy, and all this stuff. I mean, it's very meaningful. And there is also another part of this, his what he did that brought to another consequence that was essentially he prepared the ultimate detachment of Italy from the Byzantine East, wiping out the Exarchate and fundamentally triggering those mechanisms that we have seen now, for which the Franks even at the point took control of also of those areas indirectly, even before conquering them. And therefore he paved the road for the reordination of a Western European order that would bring to the this new Christian empire into the universalism of the Church of Rome, and that had this enormous importance, at least between the 19th and 14th century. It is, you can say it also as a direct consequence of those years in the essentials. And even within the same Longobard Italy, the relatively short reign of Aistulf was very, very important, because first of all, there was no let's say Aistulf and Ratkes represented fundamentally a new type of nobility, one stemming from Friuli and not belonging to the ancient female line of the Latingi that had been so important in Longobard history since the migration era. They brought this Friulan element at the head of the Longobard kingdom. They Aistulf had tried to reorganize Longobard, the Longobard army, at least for this final step of reconquest of let's say finishing of completion of the conquest of the Italian peninsula, and he had to take care in this optic the traditional the influence of the Romans, the Roman subjects they had on the empire. Aistulf was in a certain sense the first Longobard king that had to deal effectively, or directly at least, with Roman subjects en masse, even understanding the economical potential of this chunk of Byzantine Italy that he managed to conquer. Of course, also other Longobard kings had dealt with this problem, but it had happened in a moment in which everything was much more much slower in many ways, in which economical potential was not so important. Aistulf was the first Longobard king who, legislated on this, not just on the organization of the army, but also for the introduction of the Roman element into the army that was fundamentally posed as a parallel, on a parallel ladder for the recruitment of the army on the base of their own wealth, the introduction of the merchants. So Aistulf was in a condition that fundamentally into which he realized that things had to change within the internal organization of the Longobard kingdom in terms of military power, how and he brought this new energy in. I mean, Aistulf was indeed a very warlike king. He I don't know whether we can talk about this for this kind of character of a Freeland character that was more traditionalist, more warlike, more aggressive. I tried to draw this parallelism with with Longobard Austria and Frankish Austrasia, but it's kind of meaningful that even if you look at the other Longobard kings, some of them were pretty warlike. If you take Authari as well, Rothari also conquered. He was more famous as a legislator, definitely, but he conquered big chunks of even Byzantine Italy. Even Liutprand tried, but Aistulf was perhaps the only Longobard king that brought this immediate impellent necessity to seize the whole peninsula, finally, to occupy Rome, to occupy Ravenna, to which he succeeded. The Longobards had fought for centuries now against the Byzantine Exarch, and Aistulf was the one who managed to conquer Ravenna. So things could really go into another direction. Aistulf wanted essentially to project the Longobard kingdom towards the next stage of reunification and reorganization. We don't know enough in terms of strictly administrative reforms or stuff like that. We don't see that. We think it's not really expressed. I mean, he had also other things to deal with, but if you study his laws, are pretty markedly pragmatic. In my opinion, you can, if you read them, there is also a very energetic character emerging from the picture. It's pretty evident that Aistulf had something in his mind that he firmly believed in, that he wanted to take the Longobard kingdom to the next step of the formal expulsion of all the Byzantine territories. Always bearing in mind, however, this political balance that we have tried to explain today that exists, and that he played on pretty well. And in general, what is astonishing about Aistulf is his energy. I mean, his resilience. He was defeated twice. He was going to fight for the third time, and this is something. These weren't privileged people in the way we imagined them. I mean, being a monarch in the 8th century was a terrible experience indeed. It was terrible, generally speaking, to live in those times, from our perspective. But can you think there is the psychological pressure? I mean, the responsibility that you have to be a king in that context for your own people, especially if you're so truly traditionalist, so impetuous, so sentimental, as Aistulf seems to have been. Think about the episode in which he wanted to kill Liutprand with his own hands. If we assume that these details on Aistulf's character are correct, this was a person who really deeply felt, who really deeply was convinced, engaged into he believed into his mission. And I would say that, just imagine what it takes to be defeated once in that way against the Franks, and then twice, and the humiliation and everything, and yet he had still the physical and the psychophysical resources and to carry on. Having the moral resources to carry on after such heavy blows is, pretty amazing. This man had. And I wouldn't go so far to say that, certain historians interpret Aistulf as a sort of anti-Roman king. There is this, I haven't addressed this because I don't know why. I thought it was kind of a myth, fundamentally. So I didn't want to even put it in your mind, but several historiographers basically say that he was against even as if he had been a crypto-Aryan. The idea that there was someone who wanted to oppose, for instance, the full, because Catholicization. This is the wrong idea that has been developed by historiography back in the day, is that Catholicization equals Romanization, and therefore a sort of denial of the Germanic character of the Longobards. So since the Friolan nobility is always seen as the more traditionalist side of the Longobard society, the idea was that Aistulf was so harsh against his brother Ratkis because he was accused in turn to be a kind of a Catholic or philo-Roman, and also so harsh against Rome, trying to conquer it, because he had this kind of anti-Catholic, anti-Roman feelings as a crypto-Aryan or a traditionalist German, fundamentally. But this is a superficial read. It's very dichotomic. It doesn't leave much. It's too. There is no historical proof really of this. You can't even think it. It might even be true, as far as I'm concerned. I can't even accept it. I think it's also plausible, but I don't think it's very probable. Because I believe that, first of all, we know too few about the Longobard kingdom and how internal dynamics, politics and society were at the time. I think we have this true ideological view of many periods of that time. And I believe that we should refocus really on the dynamics, thinking that these were mostly pragmatic people who had nothing to. And we have seen, by the way, just this last list now, how Aistulf was also supportive of the local church and how much he cared about canonical laws, how also his wife was very pious in many ways. His brother-in-law was also excuse me, not brother-in-law, but whatever. Anselm, his wife's brother. So yeah, and I wouldn't indulge into that. By the way, we know nothing about what his wife Giseltrud did after his death. This is normal because it's already very lacking in the first place that we're already lacking in the first place to know that he had a wife, because really the evidence is relatively scanty. We don't know many, there's nothing strange. Also, we have no new of children as well. We don't know. It's not that he didn't have. We don't know. He probably had, as it was normal at the time. We actually know the name of one of his brothers, aside from another of his brothers, aside from Ratkis, which was Ratkite, who actually appears in our sources only when Aistulf with his father and siblings goes to Pavia to receive Liutprand's condemnation, fundamentally, and that's pretty much it. We don't know anything about him. So this is all about Aistulf's family as well. So for now, it's a very long video. This was a biographical video. It took a freaking lot of time, and okay, I'll try to put it together now, and this is it. I hope it was enough. I think it's mostly, you know, what we know. I might come back on him as well, and but I think after this, for now, there won't be any particular problems. There is enough data here you can check. And for the rest, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.